users, my little help file here. Oh, sorry, question? Somebody had a question? No? Okay. All right. Yeah. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use this. You can grab your own copy and follow along. And we're going to come to our latest version of the medical office example. I think step 18 was the last one. And we'll get this up and in place, right? So I have a local copy. It's easier for me to copy from that. Oh, by the way, I do have a note up at the top. We're going to create a few accounts, right? And I'm going to use the same password for all of them. I've learned by now not to just use the plain vanilla word password. It undoubtedly will get lots of complaints from different browsers about the level of security and so on. So here's one that I can remember easily. I put 5s for the S's and an @ symbol for the O of password, right? So at least, yeah, I'm just going to be consistent with that. All right, so let's come down first. We're going to start in Program.cs. So the first thing I'm going to do is come here where we're doing our add default identity. And before I forget, make sure this require confirmed account is set to false, right? Otherwise, since I can't confirm accounts, that will only get me in trouble at this point. We can look at changing that later on if we really want to. Okay. But you know, it really only comes into play if in an application you're going to allow users to come and register themselves. When you're doing an application for internal use, very often that's not the case. You don't leave it open for people to come and register. I mean, it's the employees. So usually someone will go and set up the new employee in the system, right? They might get an invitation to come and log in for the first time and create a password, maybe using the forgot password approach or whatever, right? But they don't actually come and register themselves. Anyway, okay, that's that. So we have to come here, we add this one line here so that we're directly adding support for roles inside of our approach. Now, the next chunks of code are right out of that reference, okay, that I gave you at the beginning, this one here, right? If you go through and follow the examples in here on how to get it all set up, you'll find all the code that I'm about to use here inside there as well, right? So what I'm going to do next is decide how much of a Grinch we are in terms of our passwords and so on. Important point, it has to come after we add default identity. This must, in our Program.cs file, come next. Well, it doesn't have to come next, but it has to come after that. So here I am setting required digit, let all this true and so on, okay, required length and so on, right? There's a lockout setting. I'm setting it for 5 minutes, okay, maximum failed access attempts and so on, and we'll lock them out for so many minutes. Here's also allowed username characters, right? So if you want to allow something that's not here, then you can just modify this string and away you go. Something else I'm going to throw in this code, again, it's right out of that textbook tutorial, so to speak, is this chunk here, right? We're just configuring our cookie settings, okay, and expire time for the cookie for the application itself. And as well, here are some default paths for logging in, right? And you might say, ooh, where are all of these? Okay, I don't even see them. Well, guess what? Right up here in areas, you'll see identity. It's been there all along, right from the beginning, right? So here is identity, account, and so on. Well, you go into identity and you don't see anything else, right? The only thing under pages you see a view start, okay? Not very helpful there, right? But the truth is the pages exist. Just because they aren't here, they're still inside of compiled Razor libraries, right? Well, again, I mentioned it. We'll show you later on how you can unzip them, so to speak, and make them available so you can make modifications. So right now, they're compiled and the system just goes and gets them as needed. All right. So that's basically all the code I actually have to have inside of here, right? Now, it's an option. What you also can do, it's at the bottom of my copy paste file. I didn't mention it in the PowerPoint. Uh, And in the end, I don't know if it's really worth bothering with, but you'll read about it in that tutorial, so I might as well talk about it as well. We can say that instead of coming to each and every controller and putting our annotations at the top to say authorize or whatever, you can just blanket say everything in my application requires authorization, right? We can do that here, okay? I'll usually do it right before we go .build at the end. We're going to add authorization, okay? And as we do so, we're going to specify a fallback policy, right? So this is right out of that textbook tutorial link that I gave you, right? So services add authorization with this option of fallback policy. Basically, authorization policy builder will give us this, and we're going to require authenticated user, period, blank, okay? And that means that everywhere you go, we're going to actually require authorization, unless, right? Remember we talked about there was an annotation we can put here and there called allow anonymous. So let me warn you, before you do this, or make sure you don't, if you do this, don't forget to come up to your home controller at the very least. Come down here, oop, and add allow anonymous. Otherwise, you'll be in an infinite loop, because this will be the default path, right? You know, our map path that takes us right to the home controller index action. So it'll come here, and with this fallback policy in place, it'll say, you can't come here because you're not authenticated. So it's going to what? It's going to reroute us to the login page. Oh, we can't go there because we aren't authenticated, and so on. And so it'll end up in a vicious circle, or it can, depending on how everything is set up. So definitely set up allow anonymous on your home controller if you're going to go ahead and do that. Okay. Anyway, so I'll leave it like that. We're going to give it a try. You know, in the end, doing this, to me, it's really not a big deal, because I usually find I end up going and putting some annotation on every controller anyway, and that's all it really saves. I mean, if you need anything else, any roles specified or anything, you're going to have your own annotation there. So it really, in the end, doesn't save much of any work. But it's kind of interesting to see you can do it at least. Okay. All right, so how do we actually get our role manager and user manager up and get them actually working for us to create some initial uh, seeded values, so to speak? Well, we're going to do that in data. Remember, we had our medical office initializer, right, that worked with our medical office context. Well, we already have our application DB context, okay? Notice it's inheriting from identity DB context. And by the way, you can create additional things in here if you ever wanted to, but we don't usually, right? But I do need, what I do want in here now is something similar to my initializer. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to add a class. My class is going to be, I'm going to call it, to kind of follow the same approach, application DB initializer. And once more, it can be a static class, and I'm going to have a static method called seed. Okay, very similar to what we did with our production tables as well, right? I'm just going to replace it with our code, and we'll walk through it here. Notice it was busy adding some usings up top here, and that's why it was red underlined for a moment. Okay, so our application DB initializer, we have our seed where we pass in our application builder, the same one we're using in our program.cs file, right? So we go in the same way we did in our other initializer, okay, for our production tables. We go and we get our context. This time, of course, it's an application DB context, not a medical office context. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to call migrate. That just guarantees that the database is there. Now it should already be there because of I'll probably have already called the one for the other production tables, but it just guarantees that we've migrated and created all of the tables necessary to store all of our users and the logins and so on. Okay, now I mentioned earlier we have two kinds of helpers available, right? Our role manager, so it's just how to go and get it basically from the dependency injection system without it being injected, right? And it will just give us our role manager for our identity roles. Now this is my code, right? Here is where I'm creating my own string array of different role names. So I'm just going to go off assuming I'm going to have an admin role and a supervisor role. So remember that gives us right away 4 different levels, right? We have a anonymous user who's not logged in. We have a logged in user not in any role. And then we have people who are supervisor or admin. Or technically, you might have somebody who is both a supervisor and admin, right? If you want to call that a 6th one, that's up to you. Okay. So that just prepared. So in your case, if you want, in your situation, you're doing work for a client and they have 5 different roles they want set up in their system, you just add more to the string array, and that's all you have to do. So then it just goes through, right? Just creates a role result so we can check the result. I'm not even bothering, right? We're just going to go through all the names of all these roles, right? just go to the role manager. First of all, we make sure it doesn't exist yet. Okay, we don't want to try and recreate it if there is one there already of the same name, or we'll just get an error. So if it doesn't exist, we just call create async from our role manager, passing in an identity role with the role name we've specified. And that's it. So we get down to here and we've created all of our roles. In my case, 2 roles, admin and supervisor. Now we're going to spin up a user manager. Okay, you'll find this, we won't very often use a role manager because really this is the only time we need to create roles, right? It's not something you normally add dynamically later on. You usually predefine what roles your system has because for one thing, the annotations are going to be referencing the different roles. So usually you don't really change them, right? But we'll be adding users all the time, right? So we'll often use user managers in other controllers and so on as well. But here we're going to use the same approach to get this required service, our user manager. And now we have it. This is the kind of logic we're going to do. Again, we need to check to make sure that this user isn't been created already. And we do that this way. Okay. Now, mind you, I should maybe stop for a moment and talk about this. Mentioned it earlier, but we're going to go off initially assuming that username and email are identical, right? That's how many systems work in the world today is you just use an email address, that becomes your username, and we're going to go on that assumption as well. So if I go and find a given identity user by their email address, okay, then I'm satisfied that I've found them or not, okay? And remember, we did have an option there to guarantee that no 2 people can have the same email address, right? That was right back here in Program.cs, uh, require unique email, okay? So that's true. Okay, coming back here. All right. So if they aren't there, so if we go to look for them and the result is null, so they don't exist, then we'll spin up or create a new user, a new identity user. And notice this, we make sure we set both email and username to the same value using our email address, right? They're both required, so we actually have to supply a value for each. Okay, and then we just come to the user manager, tell them to create this user. We pass the user object, the identity user, and whatever password we want. So I'm consistently using this one password, right? Just because we're only building this and we need to be able to do lots and lots of testing. So I don't want to have to try and remember a difficult password, but it can't be too simple either. And there we go. All right. So now this if is here because not so much that, I'm double checking that I did create the user, but I want to add them to a role. So I definitely have to make sure that they've been created first. So if the result is succeeded, then I'm going to come to my user manager, add to role, okay, the user, and then the name of the role that I want to add them to. And that's it. So I just repeat that process for all the users I want to create. So I'm going to make a new one here, super@outlook.com, Superman, okay, super, and that's the username and the email. And then create them as a user. And then if we successfully created them, I will add them to the role of supervisor. There we go. Now we're going to make a third one, just simply called user@outlook.com. Same process up to here, but notice, okay, we don't have this if down here about succeeded because we aren't going to add them to a role. So this is an example of that other case where we have a user who's logged in, they're authenticated, but they aren't in any role. All right, and again, good practice. Here I have a catch block, of course, because we're making changes to the system. And I'll just set a breakpoint there so that if I did get an error at any point, I can stop here and I can examine the exception and try to figure out what's going wrong, just like we've done in the past with our medical office initializer. Okay, how do we actually work with that? Well, remember, right down here before we call .run, that's where we call our medical office initializer to do its work. So it makes sense that we would do the same thing here for the application DB initializer as well. Okay, all right. So now with that extra code we threw into Program.cs, now I did now set up allow anonymous. I should be able to give this a trial run and see. This one, while I'm waiting for this to bake, somebody earlier spoke up for a second, but I didn't hear what the question was. Anybody? No? Okay, I'll keep my eye on the chat window as well as much as I can. All right. Should be appearing here any moment. There we go. Here it is in the browser. All right. So you see, we were allowed to come here because I had allow anonymous. But if I try to go anywhere else, okay, I get directed to log in. Doesn't matter where I go, even though I haven't added any authorized attributes, okay, that global sort of fallback policy we put in place is saying, no, we can't go anywhere else till I log in. Well, fortunately, I can log in. Now, from doing the class this morning, my browser is remembering all three of these users, okay? And maybe I'll start with just a user. Now, the password is the one that we hard coded in, so it's nice it's remembering it for me. So I can just come in here and log in, and there we go. So now I'm logged in. So right now at this point, though, there's nothing I can't do, right? I'm not restricted. There's really no, yeah, I don't want, there's really nothing that is off limits for me, right? I'm logged in, and that's all it takes to access all of the pages. So that'll be the next little exercise we do. Okay? All right, so I might stop and start the recording just to break these up a little bit more.